Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Rowley. I am the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Central Library, and we're very happy and excited to be hosting today's third presentation from the from the NOAA Science Council and the Office of Education. A few logistics to get out of the way first. You, as an attendee, are muted, so all of your questions and comments do have to go through the question panel. We will be taking questions at the end of the panel, so please, as you're thinking of your questions, put them in the question panel and we will be asking them at the end. We also will have a poll going on throughout this presentation, so keep your eye out on the chat. That is where I will be putting the poll link. I will be doing that periodically for those who come late. Also, we are recording this presentation, so if you need to step away, if you would like to share this with a colleague, or if you want to share this with your office, this will be recorded. It will be up on the library's YouTube channel later today or beginning of tomorrow. You won't have to wait long to revisit this. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Brittany Struck, to introduce our panel and get us started.
Thank you, Katie. And again, just reminding people, we'll have those poll questions coming throughout the session, so please feel encouraged to answer. Hello, welcome to the third panel for hiring managers. Today's topic is social justice at NOAA, a discussion of equity, belonging, and allyship in the workforce. I am Brittany Struck, and I am a fish biologist with NOAA Fisheries and an executive board member for Latinos at NOAA Employee Resource Group, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this session. This is the third and last seminar in this series for hiring managers hosted by the NOAA Science Council, the Office of Education, and the NOAA Central Library. I'd like to thank our NOAA library colleagues, especially Katie Rowley, for their valuable assistance with establishing these activities. So in March 2021, the majority staff of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology analyzed workforce data for 7 science agencies within the committee's jurisdiction, including NOAA. Among its report showed NOAA's workforce declined by 8.6% from fiscal year 09 to 2020. During this time period, the NOAA STEM workforce declined by 1.6%. At the end of the fiscal year 2020, NOAA employed roughly 8.5 male engineers for every 1 female engineer. And while STEM employment among underrepresented groups at NOAA increased by 13.6% from fiscal year 16 to 2020, only 0.4% identified as Black or African American. NOAA's STEM workforce experienced large declines in several critical scientific occupations, including fish biologists with an 8.1% decline, oceanographers with a 9% decline, and wildlife biologists with a 30.4% decline. Behind these statistics, investigators discovered worrisome trends. Research funded more slowly, laws and regulations less effectively enforced, morale weakened, perspectives narrowed, and opportunities missed to cultivate and support the next generation of great American scientists. They also suggest a dangerous retrenchment of American scientific leadership. So in order to address this, the NOAA Science Council then developed a diversity, equity, and inclusion Tiger team that provided guidance on the best practices for recruitment and hiring underrepresented groups in STEM. And from these recommendations, this series of webinars was created. The purpose of the first webinar was to provide information to hiring managers on the current composition of the STEM talent pool of NOAA-supported education and training programs, and to outline the process of utilizing direct hiring authorities to hire qualified candidates from the talent pool. The second seminar focused on retaining and advancing the talent through inclusive and advancement initiatives as well as looking internally at how NOAA can ensure current colleagues experience an inclusive workplace with equitable access to advancement opportunities by all who are interested. The links for the first two seminar recordings will be shared in the chat. And so with that, today we will focus on belonging and equity within NOAA, as well as the importance of allyship. Before we dive in, there's a natural opening here to ensure folks are aware of the ongoing work, often behind the scenes, from our employee resource groups, or ERGs. Employee resource groups, for those who are unfamiliar, are employee-led groups which maintain a focus on concepts such as belonging, equity, and allyship. If you aren't actively participating in one of our ERGs, then you're encouraged to review the list of available groups within NOAA, and I think that list will be provided in the chat for you all. These groups are having the hard conversations that will hopefully bring about a shift towards equity in the workplace culture at NOAA. Okay, let's dive in. Each of today's panelists continue to make significant contributions to advance and actually implement concepts such as belonging, equity, and allyship across the agency. Our panelists were invited today to share their experience and recommendations as they relate to the idea of equity and their sense of belonging in NOAA. I'll now let our panelists introduce themselves and provide some background on their careers. I'll start with Dr. Vankita Brown.
Thanks, Brittany. Good afternoon, everyone that is joining in the East, and good morning to our colleagues in the West. As Brittany mentioned, I'm Vankita Brown, pronouns she and her, and I'm really excited to be here and talk with you today. In the spirit of our webinar on equity, belonging, and allyship in the workforce, I'm going to experiment with a different sort of introduction for myself today. I am going to tell you a little bit more about my story from the beginning, but don't worry, I promise to keep it brief. But I want you to know a little bit more about me than just my title. So I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and raised. I am an only child. My parents are not formally educated. My father would probably be considered illiterate by today's working definitions, but he was a self-taught electrician and he was brilliant. My mother was a domestic housekeeper by day, but she owned and operated her own lounge at night, and she was a seamstress. I attended Catholic school through all my years of education, and because my mother was an advocate of education, I attended college. And after completing my undergraduate degree in communication, I found enough courage to pursue a master's degree. While in graduate school for the very first time, I met a Black female professor, Dr. Maleka Horn, who changed my life. She gave me the confidence I needed to pursue a Ph.D. After attending Howard University for the first year, I found myself broke and I was about to go home. But then I learned about the NOAA Graduate Scientist Program. And I was encouraged by another Black female professor, Dr. Carolyn Stroman, to apply. And I did. I have no idea how I got in because my science grades are less than stellar. But I am a true believer in the universe conspiring for my betterment. And so I was accepted into the NOAA Graduate Scientist Program, and it changed my life. I was able to study the African American survivors of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And that fellowship led me to the full-time employment at the National Weather Service, where for the last 15 years, I have been working on educating and advising our staff on risk communication to vulnerable communities. My graduate work still informs the work that I do now as NOAA Senior Advisor for Equity, where I help to strategize internally our DEI and A work across the agency, and also our external service delivery to communities. And I'll end with one final and most important thing about myself. I love red wine, particularly Old Vine Zinfandel and tiramisu. That's me.
We have similar interests with red wine. Oh, thank you, Vankita. Dr. Sim Aberson, you may now introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sim Aberson. I'm a hurricane researcher at AOML in Miami. I have a different path into NOAA. I actually started working where I'm still working now back in 1981 when I got an internship when I was in high school. And I was lucky to go to the public schools here in I actually live in Broward County now, but I went to public schools. I grew up in Miami Beach, and they had a program where they took seniors who were interested in science and put them in different laboratories all through the county as part of their school day. So I ended up working with what was then the National Hurricane Research Laboratory in Coral Gables. It was co-located with the Hurricane Center. Before that, when I moved down to Miami, my family moved down from upstate New York, Snowbelt, and I wasn't that interested in the weather there, but when we moved to Miami Beach, our next door neighbors were a couple of retired science teachers from the school system. And it was summer, and Miami Beach back then was mostly elderly people, retired people, so I didn't have very many friends. So I hung out with all these elderly people, and they showed me NOAA weather radio. And back then, everybody had hurricane tracking charts, and they listened to the radio, and to get the latest advisories, and tracked everything on their own charts. And they taught me how to do that, and taught me about hurricanes at the time. And I was hooked. That was just, from then on, I've always wanted to do hurricanes, and here I am 40 years later, and I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do when I was 7 years old. So it's been really wonderful. They liked me when I was an intern, and they kept calling me back over the summer, and luckily they paid me. It wasn't an unpaid internship. And then after I graduated, they hired me full time. I went to Penn State, and I got my undergraduate and master's at Penn State. And I came back to what was then the Hurricane Research Division of AOML. And our director at the time, Bob Burpee, he was interested in his employees at the time and making sure that that they were happy, and he got as much out of his employees as his employees got out of the work. And he actually offered to use our funds to pay for me to go for my PhD. So I went to University of Maryland for my PhD, and I received my PhD a few years later, early in this century. And I've been working back in Miami ever since. I do, one of the exciting things I get to do is fly hurricanes and do a lot of observations. I do a lot of different work with the observations and modeling and data assimilation. But I also really enjoy doing the education and outreach and public outreach to the public and the news and things like that. And you can see behind that I also like red wine. There's a big rack of red wine back there. Tiramisu, not so much, but red wine is great, and it's mango season right now, so mangoes are great. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Sim. And finally, we have Miss Catalina Martinez. Please introduce yourself.
Sure. First, you two are amazing. I'm so honored to be on this panel with you both. And Vankita, you just upped the game big time for these intros, didn't you? Whoo! And yes to red wine. Yes to red wine and tiramisu. So I also, as we heard from our two amazing panelists, I also didn't have a traditional path to ocean sciences. But first, I'm going to say that I'll acknowledge that I live on the traditional land of the Narragansett Nation in Rhode Island, and I honor their histories and ancestors, as well as their perseverance in our communities today, despite widespread historic territorial appropriation and genocide, and I'm thankful for their presence. So my path to ocean sciences was a very windy, twisty road with a lot of potholes. I also didn't have a direct path even to obtaining a general education. So I grew up in a hardworking, traditional Cuban family of immigrants, and they had very little money. And I was pulled out of school often as a child to help care for my very sick grandmother, and to work to help the family in a lot of other ways. My grandparents believed that girls didn't need an education and that only boys should go to school. Thankfully, I grew up in a really diverse community, predominantly African American community. So I knew there was more out there for girls than what I could see within the really limited perspectives and beliefs of my own family. So by the time I was 16, I had dropped out of school. I wasn't going very much anyway, and started working 1 to 3 jobs at a time and began the long road to obtain the education of my choosing. I was completely self-supporting at that point. I had my own apartment, and I continued to help care for my family. And with that sort of beginning to my life, I've always had to work hard in every way, right? And for everything. But more importantly, I had to learn to create community everywhere I went and surround myself with really good people. And that is how I started to really find a sense that I could belong somewhere. And it's not easy to feel that you can belong, right? So this is such an important conversation today. So I started the very long road to obtain the education that I was choosing. And I was 30, I took one class a semester for a really long time, worked a lot of different jobs. I worked in the human service sector, direct human service care. I helped start an alternative middle school for potential dropout kids just like me back in my communities in Providence, Rhode Island. And that school is still going strong today. We started that school in 1989. It's called UCAP, the Urban Collaborative Accelerated Program, for anyone interested. It's an amazing place. And I worked in a shelter for women and children who were victims of abuse for a long time. So I have both of those spaces where I did a lot of direct care. And I brought that forward into my life, even though I now studied science. I always made sure to bring it all full circle. So I was about 30 years old before I got an undergraduate degree. Ancient, I know. And I, again, was surrounding myself with good people all along the way who provided me essential guidance and assistance and knowledge, right? Sharing those unwritten rules and the opportunities that you can't possibly know about unless you build community. And Vankita, I can hear that you and Sim both had that kind of experience as well along the way. We don't get anywhere on our own, right? It's the people that we surround ourselves with that help guide us and help us have the courage and the stamina to keep going when things are tough, right? So I got 3 graduate degrees from the University of Rhode Island. I did everything in the same state, and some of you, this may resonate. I couldn't really leave Rhode Island because I was still caring for my mom all these years later. So a lot of folks, place-based experiences are relevant in a lot of ways. Family comes first, right? So I continued my education for a long time, and I got really lucky in 2002, and I got the guidance to apply for the Sea Grant John Knauss Marine Policy Fellowship, like probably many people on this call today. So many of us started our our professional careers through these internships, fellowships, scholarships, right? And so the Sea Grant Fellowship, that Knauss Fellowship, is really kicked off my career in ocean sciences. And I'm still with the same program, ocean exploration, 20 years later. So we know that these opportunities are, they create professional networks for you that you would never have access to otherwise. They are life-changing for those who are lucky enough to obtain them. And a lot of the work I do in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and access realm is really associated with identifying and mitigating the barriers to entry into these powerful, high value experiences for students who are not from the dominant culture, because these opportunities still remain largely inaccessible to us. So I remain the exception and not the rule, and that's not okay. So I will always continue to strive to help expand the opportunities for people who come from challenging circumstances, but also help them expand their vision of who they can become and where they belong. And so for those of you who know me, you know that I do that work a lot. This equity, justice, belonging, and allyship conversation is near and dear to my heart. So thank you so much to the group who put this together, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Catalina. As we begin our panel discussion, audience members should feel encouraged to provide questions using the chat box. And I think it's a great time right now just to remind people of the poll questions that you should be seeing going out. Just a reminder to respond to those. I'll turn it over to Katie to read to the audience the questions when it's time. So here we go. The first question for our
Brittany,
panelists.
can I interrupt real quick? I just wanted to remind Catalina to get the poll started because nothing is happening on the poll front. So if that wanted to get going, thank you.
Are still getting in the system.
So we're just doing a quick check-in. It's a word cloud generator, and I'll share my screen. And you can keep going, sorry.
Oh, okay, great. So we'll start with this first question. It has two parts. So there are several versions or perhaps a general confusion between equality and equity. So what is the best definition of equity you have heard or seen in the context of the workplace? That's the first part. The second part is, what is NOAA doing to improve equity in the workplace? And from the various literature and articles I read, one example of an area in equity is personal health and safety choices during this pandemic, particularly as it relates to situational telework, remote flexibilities within the workplace. So I just offer that to the panelists as we're thinking of our responses. I'll start with Vankita, then Sim, then Catalina. So Vankita, please offer a response.
Thanks, Brittany. Sure. So we have a couple of illustrations that are circulating that I think actually do justice to the difference between equity and equality. We have the apple tree that sort of bent over a little bit, and the pickers, who I think are children, one has more access than the other, and then there's one where you have three folks of different sizes that are standing on boxes trying to see the baseball game. I think those are really good illustrations, but to put words to those, the difference between equity and equality is sameness versus fairness. So equality is the practice of giving the exact or same resources to everyone across the board, no matter circumstances, situations, or their respective needs. And it doesn't take into consideration that we're not all the same and that we didn't all start from the same place, as Catalina talked about with her experience, and even with mine and Sim as well. But still, we would all get the same thing. So that is equality. Equity, by contrast, is that the practice of recognizing that we don't all start from the same place. Some people do have more access to opportunities than others. And we all have unique and special needs. And so equity says that we get the exact resources allocated to us that will address our unique and special needs so that we can all have positive and successful outcomes. So as an example, in most advertisements for jobs, there's a statement that says, no, we don't discriminate based on age, race, sex, religion, sexual identity, orientation, etc. That is a statement of equality. That is a practice of equality. We will not discriminate based on these variables. By contrast, affirmative action, affirmative employment and education is a practice of equity. It recognizes that historically certain groups have been denied access to wealth through barriers to education and barriers to employment. And it tries to address those inequities by allowing groups to participate in ways that they were not before and give them access to education and to employment, and by extension, wealth. So that is, to me, the difference between equality and equity. Brittany, I think you had a second part of that question, which I'll try to remember.
No, that was great. The second part was, how do you see NOAA, and what do you see NOAA doing to improve equity in the workplace? Maybe maybe one example, and then we can move on.
Okay, so shameless pitch. Next week, we are hosting our first Equity in Action Symposium. And there we will talk about some of the work that we've done internally to assess really our barriers to provide services to our communities. But I bring that up because I think in doing that sort of examination, it revealed a lot of our internal practices that are creating inequities. There are significant overlaps between the work that we do externally in terms of providing services and products and our lack of diversity internally. We found through these assessments that we have not been doing really great work in many underserved communities because we don't have staff that identify with these communities. And so many folks have not felt comfortable, Catalina brought up belonging, not felt comfortable going into communities that don't look like them. And so we have not been doing that outreach in ways that we could. So that has made us turn a lens internally to examine our practices around recruitment and hiring and also advancement. So I think these conversations that we're having here is one practice to highlight the importance of equity to our workforce, because it does have a direct correlation on the work that we do externally with community. And so please come by next week, July the 19th at 2 o'clock to learn about all of the work that we're doing. Thanks, Brittany.
Thank you, Vankita. Sim, an offering of perhaps your definition of equity and what you see NOAA doing to improve equity in the workplace.
Yeah, I think Vankita covered the definition really well. I don't really have much to add. As to what NOAA's doing, I think NOAA's doing some stuff now. For example, I'm a mentor of a La Penta intern this summer, and the La Penta internship has made it a point to reach out to try to encourage students, the first student in the family to ever go to college, and underserved minorities to join the LaPenta cohort, and they're keeping track of that information. I'm not sure if this is the first year they're doing that, and I think that would be great to do for all the different programs. NOAA has a number of different programs, the Cooperative Science Centers, EPP, MSI, things like that. You can get information at the NOAA education website on these different programs, and it's trying to reach out to communities that we don't traditionally reach out to and get them involved in the work that NOAA does, and try to bring future scientists and others into the NOAA workforce, so that we don't have the problems that Vankita was talking about, that we aren't reaching a lot of different communities because they don't look like the people who are doing that outreach work. So NOAA is doing that, starting to do that work, and I think it's very important to continue that work and build up the workforce so that we can reach all these communities. And in many ways, this is a matter of life or death: heat waves and hurricanes and severe weather and things like that, and climate change, raising sea levels. We need to reach out to the vulnerable communities that we haven't reached in the past, and make sure that they hear the messages that they need to hear.
Perfect. Thank you, Sim. Catalina, if maybe you have some offerings, if we're working off from the same definition for equity, maybe you have some insight on how you see NOAA is navigating issues in equity.
Sure. You know, a lot of us out here in the NOAA workforce do a lot of this work, right? We do a lot of the DEIAJ work. It isn't always valued equally with the other work that we do. It is often something that gets put aside if you know, things start to get tight or the funding doesn't come forward for it. And I think what I see happening with our current administration in the White House, with the White House executive orders that have set precedent in ways I have personally never seen before. I don't know, they have over 40 executive orders that have equity built into them. And knowing that there are mandates that the federal agencies have to meet associated with these equity assessments and such, to demonstrate internal and external mitigation of whatever barriers we might find when we do these assessments, right? So doing that work, to me, is a critical step. It's an enormous step forward. I've been in NOAA, again, I said, for 20 years, and the past few years have really been so eye-opening, I think, to many of us. But looking through a justice and equity lens is so critical, because it's the only way we're going to think in terms of how to level the playing field for all in all that we do, right? We have to look at not only our policies, our procedures, our processes, but also our beliefs, our practices, our behaviors. You know, that's where I personally see a lot of the shift happening, and that makes us more intentional in our actions, right? And so having these conversations is a really important component of that as well. And I also encourage everyone to join Vankita, our equity lead for NOAA. I mean, oh my God, we have an equity lead for NOAA, and they were smart enough to select Vankita. So this is a monumental shift for this agency, I think for many agencies, to even create these positions and elevate them to the level that this position is, and to see the value there. So I think we're seeing progress for sure. Thank you.
Awesome, great answers. Thank you, panelists. So our next question here is, how might a person's sense of belonging impact their opportunities? For example, their access to leadership, advancement, just in terms of the sense of belonging and what that does to a person's opportunities within the workforce. And then can you define belonging before answering? And I think Catalina, we'll start with you this time, and then we'll go to Vankita, and then Sim, you can close us out for this question.
Sure. And so first I activated another poll. So I think belonging is such an important component of just the human experience, right? It's the quality of our human experience, that feeling of connection you have within a particular community or space, the sense that you're valued, that your contributions, your voice, your opinions, your presence and well-being really matter there, right? And we opened a poll so that we can take a look at our audience and how they experience belonging. What I've learned through a lot of the work that we do is that no matter if you're part of the dominant culture in a space, you can still experience a lack of sense of belonging there, right? Our intersectional identities are complicated. And so I think when you think about belonging, it's almost the intersection where diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of come together. There are in-groups and out-groups based on a whole host of complex factors. And, you know, it's the degree to which you might feel that you have some level of influence or power to really contribute to or shape the culture, the dynamic, and the narrative within that community or space, right?
Right, perfect. Vankita, your offering on sense of belonging and how that might impact people's opportunities or access to advancement.
Sure. Thanks, Brittany. You know, just to follow on, I think Catalina, I don't know if I could add more. It definitely is being in a space where you believe that you matter, that your contributions matter, and that you are seen, and that you can show up in that space, be your authentic self, and not be judged for that. And we talked about ERGs a little bit earlier. Brittany sort of, you know, introduced the concept and the topic in the communities. I will say, I think Danae is on here. He's probably gonna shoot me a text after this, but Danae and Michelle Hawkins created the employee resource group that I belong to, and diversity and professional advancement group. Actually, Sim belongs to it and Catalina belongs to it too. But I will say that employee resource group made such a difference in my life when I joined NOAA. I think I was at NOAA maybe 4 years before the group got established. And I tell people this all the time, and it's not an overstatement. That group saved my life. It gave me purpose. It gave me a sense of community within an organization that I was not sure I belonged to. I did not think I fit in NOAA until this community came about, and I saw myself, I saw others, and I just fell in love with the entire group. And because of that is why I'm Senior Advisor for Equity. That group rallied around me, believed in me, said, you can do something. and that is why I stand here before you today. So that, I think, Brittany, is the contribution that a sense of belonging gives to people.
I think you said something so important. When you were surrounded by that group, or when you entered that group, you saw people who you saw yourself, right? You saw people who look like you and who resonate with you, and you had that community. So I think that's so powerful in terms of actually feeling like you belong and where you can be your authentic self, which is such a challenge sometimes. Thank you. And then I think for this question, we're gonna have Sim respond and close us out in terms of how might a person's sense of belonging impact their opportunities or access to advancement?
Yeah, I have a different sense of belonging because, you know, the group that I'm in, it isn't an issue of looking like other people, but it's an issue of being like other people. I'm a gay man, and I was out in the workplace back in the 1980s, which is very different from what it is now. And, you know, I was lucky in that I had some people who were above me who didn't care or were okay with that. Bob Burpee, who I mentioned, he not only was he a great scientist, but he loved the ballet, and he traveled all over the world to follow ballet and philharmonic orchestras and things like that. So he was very, very into the arts, and he surrounded himself with a lot of gay men and women. And so, you know, I was out and open, and that was okay with him, and he, you know, sponsored me. But besides that, I didn't feel like I really belonged, and we really didn't talk, Bob and I really didn't talk about it that much either. You know, I do know that in the 1980s, there was 2 people in our lab, 2 men who passed away from AIDS, but it wasn't talked about, and I never talked with them, and they never talked with me about being gay. It was very isolating. It was a very isolating time. And when you're isolated like that, you don't present your full self. You can't be who you are and do your work as well, because, you know, a lot of your effort is spent in hiding or thinking, oh my God, should I do this? Oh my God, can I do that? Can I, you know, say this word? You know, you're thinking about a lot of stuff that you really shouldn't need to be thinking about, and not what you really should be thinking about. So, you know, this sense of belonging is great. And, you know, I'm a member of 2 ERGs, the DPA that Vankita was talking about and co-leads now. And I'm also on the board of NOAA Pride. And that gives us a really wonderful sense of community. And, you know, I never thought I'd work in a place where in my lab, the director of our lab and the associate director of our lab are both openly gay. And, you know, I never imagined that I would see that, and I never imagined that I would, you know, participate in a raising the pride flag at work this past month. And, you know, it's pretty amazing after all this time that happens. And, you know, I hope, you know, that continues, and that all communities, everybody feels a sense of belonging, whatever their axis of difference is, that they feel they have.
And Brittany, if I could just say one thing. I watched all the comments as they came in to the poll, and both of our fabulous panelists and our audience mentioned a few things I just wanted to point out. So the feeling, what you were experiencing, Sim, having your intellectual and emotional bandwidth taxed all the time. We call it the culture tax. And it is a constant stress of not belonging. Imagine the creativity, the innovation, the brilliance that could be brought to bear if we all just felt we belonged and that we were valued, right? We are constantly paying that tax when we don't feel we belong in a space. And the second thing is, I saw imposter syndrome come through a lot through the comments, and I would love to see us turn that around. We know when we feel we don't belong, it's not really about us. It's about the environment not embracing us. It's the imposter environment. So instead of internalizing it, please look outward. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Catalina. One thing, Sim, you mentioned early on that it didn't seem like there was space for conversation or space to share. And I think now we're in a time with the ERGs and sense of community that there is now that creative space to actually have a conversation that might feel uncomfortable or awkward, or at least know that you have a community that wants to have that conversation. So that encouragement is so important. And I think it ties well with our next question. And Sim, we'll start with you, but for our last question, before we turn it over to the audience, is what are some qualities of an effective ally? And before you answer, perhaps if you could define allyship in what it means for you. So Sim, we'll start with you, Catalina, and then Vankita can close us out for this question.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and it's, you know, I can't come up with a very succinct definition of what an ally is. And while I'm talking, I might get into a little bit more what an ally isn't than what an ally is. But an ally is, you know, somebody who helps a lot and is, you know, it wants to help others achieve what they can achieve and be the best that they can be. But it isn't somebody who takes over. It isn't somebody who does it for their own grand, you know, feeling like they're doing something on their own. It's somebody who I see it a lot in many ways as something internal, that it's somebody who has a commitment to listen to the voices of others and learn from the voices of others and use the knowledge that they gain by listening and learning to help advance others to reach their goals. You know, so I was thinking about a high school teacher that I had back in the 1980s, and his name was Milton Zola. He I was lucky to have the first person to teach a computer course in the state of Florida with Apple II computers. And he taught computers, and he taught me calculus and trigonometry. And he taught bilingually. He taught in English and Yiddish. And he was a great teacher. And I kept in touch with him. He was in his 70s when I was a high school student. So he was much older. And he really didn't talk about himself a lot, except, you know, he was an older Jewish man. He was, you know, retired, and he decided to teach in the schools. And it wasn't until many years later I was reading a history of Black Miami, and his name kept coming up throughout the book as somebody who he was a white Jewish man, but he was somebody who came up as somebody who was instrumental in helping the cause of civil rights in the 60s and 70s. And he did it without trying to gain any fame for himself. He opened his home, he gave what he could, he did what he could. And that's how I see an ally. He, you know, he sacrificed, he gave what he could for others, not for his own community, but, you know, it obviously helped his own community, but it was something that he did out of selflessness and not for his own reasons. And that's what I think an ally is.
Yeah, I think you hit on it there. It is someone doing something else for a different community, a community that they may not necessarily intersect or be a part of, but they reach out across and across to a different community. Excellent. Catalina.
Yeah, so I'm sure some folks on here who know me know that I host workshops on belonging and allyship through a series of brilliant documentary films made by a very good friend of mine, Dr. Kendall Moore. They're a film series called Can We Talk? And so I can give you a little bit of a definition, just that an ally is a person with some level of privilege, right? Some level of power or influence, who's willing to use this elevated platform to help an individual or a group of people who don't have it, or at least not at the same level, right? This ally has to be courageous because you have to be prepared for backlash and repercussions. There's some risk involved. Sometimes there's a lot of risk involved, but typically the risk to this person with the elevated level of privilege or power is certainly less than the risk to that person that they're trying to assist in a particular situation. So it's typically about mitigating different levels of risk as well. And it's all about relationships, as Sim pointed out beautifully. We know that some forms of perceived allyship can also be problematic when it's performative, as Sim pointed out, or really more about co-opting or advancing self-interests or capitalizing on this group or this individual, this situation, a disaster or a trauma. We see this happen all the time, right? They amplify themselves through, extracting something from this group or these individuals. And this can result in re-victimization, fetishizing, demoralizing, condescending, othering, all those things. So being an ally is something that we have to learn and hone as well, because, sometimes our perceived allyship might cause harm. So that's just something for us to consider.
Perfect, thank you. And Vankita, your offering on this question, and this will close us out for this question.
Wow, no pressure. Since we're closing, I mean, Sim gave a beautiful definition. Catalina followed on beautifully. I really don't know if I have much more to add here, other than to say, just to echo, I think, both points, that an ally is someone who is definitely intentional. They know that they have a level of privilege that they're willing to leverage and risk, right? To help another human being that doesn't identify as with them. I've had allies. I have allies now. I think one of my allies got me into NOAA, or I probably wouldn't be here. Curtis Carey, he's a white man, and he was, very intentional in terms of getting me here, and I think getting others who were at Howard University here in NOAA. So thank you, Curtis, for that, for letting out your jacket or your carpet to allow me to come into the agency. I really do appreciate that. And I would just, Catalina mentioned being very careful about allies who sort of name themselves. That's something that you don't get to do as an ally. And it was something that's in one of Catalina's videos that she facilitates. You don't get that privilege to call yourself an ally. Only those who, are in the community get to call you that, because you may be thinking that you're doing great work, and maybe you are, but it is really up for us to be able to judge that. So be careful, But the other piece that I would say is that as an ally, and this also comes out of one of Catalina's video, is allies have to be willing to do the very hard work. They have to be willing to wrestle with their darkness, right? We all have things that we have to work on. There's no shame in that. But you have to deal with it in order to be an ally, because there's some things you don't see. There's some history you don't know. And you have to understand that in order to be able to help other communities. So I'll end with that. Thanks, Brittany.
Thank you, panelists. That was some great responses, and hopefully just letting that sink in for our audience today, your words and your messaging on these topics. Thank you. I'll now turn it over to Katie for audience questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you, panelists. We have had a few questions come in, so I'm going to start with the very first one that came in earlier. Vankita's example about the EEO statement was a great one. So how do we get to equity in recruiting?
Was that for me or for the panel?
I believe it's free for everyone to respond to, but Vankita, if you wanted to address it first, please go ahead.
Oh, wow. Equity in recruiting. So NOAA, more than other agencies, maybe I'm overstepping here, and maybe I'm biased because I work for NOAA, but we do have several HBCUs, historically Black communities, colleges and universities, as well as other minority serving institutions that make up our cooperative service science centers. I think we do a good job of engaging with our HBCUs. Other federal agencies, maybe not so much. But the truth is, or another truth, I should say, is that we don't have enough capacity, perhaps, to hire all those students, right? And so we have to think about what are some of those barriers that are keeping our students from being able to come aboard, and address those barriers, right? Catalina talked about the work that she does with Sea Grant and other educational programs within NOAA, where she is examining barriers to entry for our students. So a lot of that work really has to do with the hard work of looking at the ways in which our policies are languaged and put in place in our practices with regard to recruitment of our students and the audiences that we engage with. Another truth is where we go to recruit the folks that come into our organization. We definitely have to cast that net wider, but we have to be willing to go there. We make assumption that people are coming to know it, but the truth is people are leaving our agencies for a lot of reasons. That's another critical and crucial conversation. Brittany, you talked about creating space for having conversations. That is a conversation we need to have. Why are people leaving, right? What are they not happy with within our organization? Sure, some are leaving to better themselves, but some are leaving because they're not happy. And we need to have a conversation about that. Along with, we have to contend with this thing about youth, right? Youth are looking at a different set of metrics, a different set of variables that they need to have in the workforce in order to come here and in order to stay. And again, we need to have conversations about that. Thanks, Brittany.
Sure. Maybe the next question, just looking at our time.
Yes, of course. Okay. How do we bring the human into our work life? Because what we're talking about are the aspects of us that are not related to academics or profession. I believe this is open to everyone.
So maybe we'll have Catalina start on this one. How do we bring the human?
I love this question so much, and it is a conversation that I've been having a lot within my community of scholars of color, right? And one of the things that Vernon Morris, for those of you who know him, he ran the EPP Howard NCAS Center for 20 years, and he's now at ASU. But he always talks about this. We have a tendency as scientists, especially the way we're trained, to compartmentalize. You know, the science is here, that, you know, the human stuff is over here, and we separate those. But we have to center humanity in all that we do. But you have to be intentional about doing that. It's a thought process, right? And so, and we are not really trained that way. And we have to consider all ways of knowing and understanding a system or a topic beyond how we're trained, right? That Western traditional mindset. You have to think in terms of, you know, amplifying other things beyond that traditional space, like the ethical tenets of Indigenous engagement, right? It's we need to think more about extractive practices. Geosciences is harm-inducing often, and its legacy has a lot of harm associated with it. So there's a time component there. So as Vankita pointed out, grappling with the darkness that comes with that. So you have to reconcile with the harm of the past, and then really reimagine a way forward that is human-centered. And sometimes that means restructuring and dismantling what's there currently, right? So you know, as we reimagine an equitable, just journey, sometimes we have to not only reimagine, but restructure, and that starts with dismantling.
Okay, maybe time for one more quick question.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to combine two of them. So the first part is anyone talking about USA jobs as a barrier itself and changes that can be made there? Also, how can those hiring officials get access to applicant demographic data, especially since they're only seeing who makes the cert? So how can we be sure that our recruitment efforts aren't reaching a diverse pool, are reaching a diverse pool if they aren't making it through the application review process?
Sim, if you want to start on a response, I'm just trying to give our panelists equal.
I can't answer to, anything about, USA jobs or getting that information. I know that's been a struggle, and it's even sometimes a struggle to get information about, the employees that we have. A lot of it depends on self-identification, and a lot of it is how the questions are asked. And I'm working with NOAA Pride, and one of the things we're trying to do is just to get basic information on gender and sexual orientation of the NOAA workforce, and it's really difficult to do. I don't have an answer to that. I did want to speak to something that Catalina mentioned. The last question was the humanity, and we're all all of us on the panel here, we're all scientists of some sort, and we come to work and we're all science all the time. But Vankita started it by mentioning she loves red wine and tiramisu, and that's part of the humanity. And we don't see that with our coworkers enough. And one of the things we tried to do at our lab is when we were actually in person, that we were having lunchtime events where we just asked various people, what are you interested in and what do you want to talk about? So people talked about their travel, or people talked about things that they were interested in outside of the work. And we had some events. We had a new employee event online on May the 4th. So we'd May the 4th be with you, and found out that we had all these Star Wars fans at our lab, and none of them knew each other because they don't talk about it. And it really opened up, and just to have some fun and bring out the humanity. And there's a lot of managers who are like, if you're not doing your work 8 hours, exactly 8 hours a day, you're not doing your work. But we need to talk about these things. We need to talk about whether we're Star Wars fans. We need to talk about whether we're gay. Other things that we don't talk about, mental health. We need to talk about, abuse in our past, all sorts of things like that. And those are things that are so important to foster a sense of belonging to, to all the people at work. So I think those are equally as important.
Thank you, Sim. Any other thoughts on the USA jobs question? I know maybe the previous webinars possibly hit on that topic, but any other responses come to mind for the question?
I'd love to just say, I work with a lot of different groups, and they tend to focus on recruitment. There's so much more work to do, as Vankita has pointed out, and as Sim has made clear as well. Targeted recruitment goes without saying, that's really important. And USA Jobs is a disaster. So yes, it needs help. I don't know that NOAA can do anything about that, but there's no one-stop shop to know about opportunities. That's a reality. But we know there's so much more work to do in terms of inclusion, equity, justice, mitigating barriers, not only to entry, but to staying and advancing within a space like NOAA. As we look up and up and up into the leadership ranks, that there is less and less diversity. I mean, we have to work on not only barriers to entry, but barriers to advancement, retention, belonging, inclusion, justice, feeling a sense of, value and success in your space. So there's a lot more work to do. So I just wanted to put that out there.
I think that's a good note. There's a lot more work to do. Katie, I'll lean on you to direct us on timing, if it's okay to go over, or Vankita, if you had a last message.
I don't have a last message, and if I want to pick this thread, but I know we aren't. Sim mentioned hiding in the workplace, and that just resonated with me so very much, Sim, because we do spend a lot of time negotiating ourselves in our workspaces, particularly for non-white folks. That's just the truth. We have to code switch. We're not sure if we should say this, how we should say this. I mentioned I'm from the Midwest. I have a Southern drawl. I have to manage that every day. Sometimes it comes out, sometimes it doesn't. But I am very conscious of me, of my identity. I'm very conscious how I show up. And I get exhausted by doing that every day. It takes a level of energy from me every day that I cannot then put into the work that I do. And I just wanted to bring that up because Sim, thank you for highlighting that for us. It's a really important piece of belonging. And that's why I wanted to start this conversation with introducing myself beyond my title, because people hear that all the time, but there's parts of me that folks don't know. But being vulnerable and telling parts of your story is a part of belonging. And trusting people to receive that and still not judge you for it. So I'll end there. Thank you, Brittany, for the opportunity.
No, absolutely. And just to that message, I added something to the chat. You reminded me of a great TED Talk I saw just about that, bringing your full self to work and having to code switch, and the burden that some of us have to, the obstacle course some of us have to walk through, just to ensure we're not doing the wrong thing. It's an interesting TED Talk, so I encourage people to look at that, because it's the same message that Vankita just delivered. Okay, well, Katie, we are over, so I guess I did not do well moderating.
No, you did fine. These are such important conversations to have that you don't want to cut them short. But we are over the 3 p.m. Cutoff. Our audience does need to leave, so I want to thank everyone for coming. And Brittany, you can close it for us.
Okay, thank you everyone again. I'd like to give a big thank you to each of today's panelists. And thank you, Katie, and thank you, audience, for tuning in today and being patient with us as we went over time. But I think these conversations are important, they're valuable, and I'm just grateful we now today have space to have these kind of conversations. So have a great rest of your day.